He uses research and science and statistics to narrow down who he believes the suspect is in the Nancy Guthrie abduction.
For 74 days, there has been no identified suspect. Despite the FBI processing tens of thousands of tips, no name has emerged. What investigators do have is physical evidence. DNA recovered from inside the home, confirmed blood on the porch belonging to Nancy Guthrie, and surveillance footage showing a figure moving onto that porch with an unnatural stillness, something that feels deeply inconsistent with the act being committed. On the 74th day, the case took a different turn. A forensic researcher examined the available data, not to speculate, but to construct a statistical profile. What came out of that analysis wasn't a theory or a guess. It was a data-driven behavioral profile, built from patterns observed across decades of violent crime research. And according to that analysis, the conclusions are more unsettling than anything publicly revealed so far. It's important to be clear, this profile does not name a suspect. It does not accuse any individual. It represents the professional interpretation of statistical evidence by a specialist whose work is grounded in empirical research. That alone makes it worth serious attention. That same day, Brian Enton, reporting from Tucson, sat down with forensic researcher Dr. Gary Brucato. What Brucato provided was not casual commentary. It was the most structured and specific public analysis of the case to date. Dr. Brucato earned his doctorate from the New School for Social Research and previously served as assistant director at the Center of Prevention and Evaluation, affiliated with both Columbia University Irving Medical Center and the New York State Psychiatric Institute. His work has focused extensively on early psychosis, risk factors for violence, and the behavioral patterns of violent offenders. He is also co-creator of the Columbia Mass Murder Database, a comprehensive study analyzing mass murder cases worldwide from 1900 to 2019. Across more than a century of data, the project examines psychological, behavioral, and psychiatric traits of offenders. In addition, Brucato has authored over 50 peer-reviewed academic publications and continues to teach, consult, and conduct forensic evaluations within the City University of New York system, while maintaining a private clinical practice. Currently, he is a visiting scholar at Boston College, where he collaborates with Dr. Ann Burgess, a foundational figure in modern criminal profiling. Dr. Burgess began working with the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit at Quantico in 1978, contributing to the development of profiling methodologies alongside figures like John Douglas and Robert Ressler. She remains active in the field, teaching at Boston College's Connell School of Nursing and leading a collaborative group of forensic experts, often referred to as her Super Sleuth Group, which includes former FBI profilers and cold case specialists who regularly analyze unresolved investigations. Within this professional network, Dr. Brucato operates at a high level of expertise. His assessment of the Nancy Guthrie case is not speculative. It is the application of a methodology shaped by decades of research, clinical practice, and direct involvement in complex violent crime analysis. Every conclusion he draws is rooted in frameworks tested against real-world cases, evidence, and outcomes. The analysis does not begin with surveillance footage or physical evidence. It starts with a statistical baseline. In the United States, between 76% and 92% of homicide victims knew the person who killed them. At the upper end, 92%. This figure applies specifically to female victims. In practical terms, that means roughly 9 out of 10 women who are killed by someone familiar to them in some capacity. This is not drawn from a single source. As Dr. Gary Brucato explains, the range reflects a consistent pattern across multiple strands of peer-reviewed homicide research. These numbers do not point to a specific suspect, nor do they prove anything about one individual case. Instead, they establish what is known as a base rate, the statistical foundation from which any structured investigation should proceed. Brucato's approach is methodical. Before examining behavioral cues or interpreting footage, he anchors the analysis in probability. The 76 to 92% range becomes the starting point. And once that baseline is accepted, it reframes the central question. The issue is no longer whether the perpetrator could be a stranger. The more relevant question becomes, based on what is statistically most likely, where should investigators focus their attention? When this statistical framework is combined with the behavioral evidence captured on the doorbell camera, the interpretation becomes more focused. Consider the psychological and physiological state of a person approaching a stranger's home with the intent to commit a violent act. The body's stress response would typically activate elevated heart rate, increased cortisol, heightened alertness. Even individuals with criminal experience tend to exhibit signs of tension in unfamiliar, high-risk environments. These reactions are often visible. They appear in subtle behaviors, hesitation, rapid scanning of surroundings, small inconsistencies in movement. Even when a face is concealed, the body tends to reveal the strain of the situation. In this case, those indicators are notably absent. The individual seen on the porch moves with control and without urgency. There is no visible hesitation, no frantic assessment of the environment. Instead, the behavior is consistently described, by investigators and by Brucato himself, with a single term, comfortable. That sense of ease suggests something important. It implies a level of familiarity, not necessarily with the victim on a personal level, but with the setting itself. The house, the entrance, the environment do not appear foreign to this person. Using both the statistical base rate and the behavioral pattern, Brucato reaches a directional conclusion. The individual responsible likely had some prior connection to Nancy Guthrie. That connection does not have to be close. It does not require friendship or trust. It may have been indirect, casual, or even one-sided. The range of possibilities remains broad. It could include someone personally known to her, but it could also extend to individuals with more limited contact, service workers, contractors, or anyone who had reason to be at or near the home. In some cases, the connection may exist primarily in one direction, where the offender had knowledge of Nancy Guthrie without her being equally aware of them. At its core, the interpretation returns to a simple but critical observation: the level of comfort displayed by the individual. Based on that alone, Dr. Gary Brucato maintains that the person responsible likely had some degree of prior familiarity with Nancy Guthrie. That insight carries a direct implication. Investigators should not limit their focus to obvious suspects, but instead broaden their scope to include anyone who may have had even minimal contact with her. That connection does not need to be personal or close. It could be distant, indirect, or even one-sided. In some cases, the individual may have known significantly more about Nancy than she ever knew about them. The range of possibilities is wide. From people deeply familiar with her life to those who only crossed paths with her in routine, functional ways. This could include individuals who had legitimate reasons to be near or inside her home, contractors, landscapers, maintenance workers, or service providers. Through ordinary access, such individuals could have developed a mental understanding of the property. Camera placements, entry points, daily patterns, and routines observable from the outside. It could also extend beyond the home itself. Someone from environments she frequented, a church, a restaurant, or even a medical facility connected to her ongoing pacemaker monitoring, might have observed her habits over time. There is also the possibility of second-hand familiarity. Someone connected to a person who knew her well, gradually piecing together information through indirect exposure. From a statistical standpoint, this does not resemble a random act. The data strongly suggests this was not committed by a true stranger, someone encountering her by chance without prior knowledge. The level of apparent control and awareness points instead to a targeted act. And targeting, by definition, depends on prior information. Prior information implies a connection, however slight. That, in turn, suggests something else. Somewhere within the network of people connected, directly or indirectly, to Nancy Guthrie, there is likely someone who holds relevant knowledge about the person responsible, whether they realize it or not, and that information has yet to surface. Beyond the absence of visible stress, Brucato identifies a more specific behavioral pattern with clinical significance. The demeanor captured in the footage aligns, in his assessment, with what is known in forensic psychology as a psychopathic character structure. This term is often misunderstood. In clinical usage, it does not simply mean violent or erratic behavior. It does not refer to the exaggerated portrayals seen in popular culture. Instead, it describes an individual whose emotional processing differs fundamentally from the norm, particularly in areas like fear, guilt, empathy, and inhibition. In most people, these emotional responses act as internal regulators. They create hesitation, generate anxiety, and serve as barriers against harmful actions. In someone with this type of character structure, those mechanisms are significantly weakened or absent. The anticipatory fear that would normally accompany a high-risk act, especially one involving entering a home at night with harmful intent, is reduced to the point of being almost non-existent. The behavior observed on that porch reflects exactly that absence. The calmness, the measured movement, the lack of urgency, these are not minor details. In Brucato's framework, they are meaningful indicators, not definitive diagnoses, but observable data points that support a specific type of inference. He is not diagnosing the individual from video footage. Rather, he is applying an established behavioral model to what can be seen, a sustained lack of stress response in a situation where such a response would typically be unavoidable. That observation, grounded in decades of research on offender behavior, leads to a focused investigative implication. A personality structure of this kind does not appear suddenly. It develops over time and expresses itself repeatedly in behavior. By the time it escalates to an act of this severity, it is almost always preceded by a history, patterns of antisocial conduct, prior incidents, interactions that may have raised concern among people in the individual's environment. As Brucato notes, this does not mean there must be a prior violent crime of the same magnitude. More often, extreme acts sit at the far end of a spectrum that includes earlier, less severe behaviors. But those behaviors leave traces, in records, in memories, in past encounters with law enforcement, employers, neighbors, or acquaintances. Someone capable of acting with that level of composure under those conditions has likely lived with that behavioral pattern for years. And over that time, it would have surfaced in ways that others may have noticed, even if they did not fully understand its significance at the time. What happened in the Catalina foothills on February 1st does not appear to be an isolated act emerging from nowhere. The individual seen on that porch is unlikely to be making a first-time decision to cross into criminal behavior. More plausibly, this moment represents the most serious point along a pattern that already existed. That pattern, if it follows what is known about similar offenders, would leave traces over time. Records, prior incidents, interactions with institutions or individuals. These are the kinds of footprints that tend to accumulate long before a crime of this scale occurs. This means the person responsible is not invisible in a broader sense. They have likely intersected with systems before: law enforcement databases, workplaces, communities, or social networks. There may already be information stored somewhere that, when viewed in light of this case, becomes newly relevant. It is also possible that someone, whether within a criminal network, a personal circle, or even currently incarcerated, could recognize the behavioral pattern being described and connect it to a specific individual. That is why the FBI tip line is not limited to eyewitness accounts of the abduction itself. It is equally important for those who have known someone exhibiting similar behavioral traits or histories to come forward. A past incident, a prior record, or even a memory that once seemed insignificant could take on new meaning when placed within this framework. That kind of retrospective recognition can be critical in moving an investigation forward. From there, the analysis shifts to a more focused question. Why was Nancy Guthrie chosen? Not a random individual, not a high-security public figure, but an 84-year-old woman living alone, with limited mobility and a highly predictable routine. In forensic research, elderly individuals, particularly those living alone, are recognized as a vulnerable and frequently targeted group. They often present conditions that certain offenders find advantageous: reduced physical resistance, consistent daily patterns, and environments that can be approached without immediately raising suspicion. Routine service access, whether by contractors, delivery personnel, or caregivers, creates opportunities for observation without triggering alarm. Nancy Guthrie's circumstances align closely with this profile. She lived alone. Her mobility was significantly limited. Her routine was stable and observable over long periods, church attendance, family interactions, repeated weekly patterns. Her home was located in a quiet residential area, especially at night. In addition, her connection to a nationally recognized media figure meant that aspects of her family's financial situation could be reasonably inferred by anyone paying attention. If the motive involved financial leverage, and the available evidence suggests that possibility, then her selection as a target reflects more than chance. It implies evaluation. Someone identified her, assessed her situation, and concluded that she was a viable target. That kind of decision typically develops over time, through repeated observation and the gradual accumulation of information. And again, that process depends on some form of proximity or connection. At this point, Dr. Gary Brucato introduces another layer to the analysis: the likelihood that more than one person was involved. In his view, the individual captured on the doorbell camera may not have acted alone. He frames this using a simple but precise distinction. The person visible on the porch is, in his terms, the waiter. The one who carries out the visible portion of the act, the approach, the physical presence, the execution of the immediate task. This is the individual exposed to risk, the one seen on camera. Behind that role, however, may be another figure, the chef. This person does not appear in the footage. Instead, they operate in the background, shaping the structure of the crime. The chef selects the target, determines the timing, and plans the logistics. Why that specific time? 1:47 a.m. Why that particular night? These are not random choices. They suggest planning, awareness of camera placement, understanding of how to approach the property, consideration of whether additional recording devices might exist, and how to account for them. The chef would also be responsible for structuring the timeline. What needed to happen within the 41-minute window, in what sequence, and with what contingencies if something went wrong. This division of roles is supported by physical evidence. In an interview on the Today Show, Savannah Guthrie described a key detail. When the family arrived, the rear doors of the home were found propped open. Not forced. Not broken. Deliberately held open. At first, the family struggled to interpret what they were seeing. One possibility was that a medical emergency had occurred during the night and that responders had entered the home. But that explanation did not hold. What initially seemed confusing ultimately pointed to something intentional, an action that fit within a planned sequence rather than an emergency response. Taken together, these elements, behavioral patterns, victim selection, and physical evidence, suggest a level of coordination that extends beyond a single spontaneous act. Keeping a rear door propped open is not a spontaneous act. It requires prior awareness that the door exists, along with a decision, made in advance, that it will serve a purpose within the plan, whether as an entry point, an exit route, or part of a broader logistical sequence. Someone acting alone, improvising inside an unfamiliar home in the middle of the night, is unlikely to make that kind of move. But someone carrying out a plan designed by a person who already understood the layout of the house would. In Dr. Gary Brucato's framework, that level of knowledge points to the unseen figure, the chef. This is the individual who likely had detailed familiarity with the home, its interior structure, camera placements, and the daily patterns, physical condition, and routines of Nancy Guthrie. That kind of understanding does not appear by chance. It is built over time, either through direct access, repeated observation, or some form of connection, however indirect, to someone who had that access. Public attention has largely centered on the person visible in the footage. That focus is natural. The video is the most tangible piece of evidence. But in Brucato's interpretation, that figure represents execution, not origin. The real source of the crime is the unseen planner, the one whose knowledge made the operation possible. That distinction matters. The individual behind the planning does not appear masked on a porch. They exist in ordinary settings. They have likely interacted with others in routine ways. Conversations, brief encounters, moments that seemed insignificant at the time. It is possible that someone, somewhere, has already crossed paths with this person and only in hindsight might recognize something unusual. A question, an interest, or a detail that now carries different weight. Another critical development in the investigation is the decision to subject a recovered glove to genealogical DNA analysis. This method gained national attention through its role in identifying the perpetrator of the Golden State Killer case, ultimately leading to Joseph James DeAngelo after decades without resolution. Unlike traditional database searches, genealogical DNA analysis does not rely on a direct match. Instead, it works by identifying genetic relatives of the unknown individual, constructing family trees, and narrowing down possibilities using a combination of genetic links, geographic data, and conventional investigative methods. The use of this technique in the Nancy Guthrie case suggests something specific. Standard database searches likely did not produce a clear identification. At the same time, investigators believe the DNA recovered, particularly from the glove, is viable enough to justify the more complex and time-intensive genealogical approach. This also indicates a commitment to identifying a suspect even if that person has no prior record in conventional criminal databases. The presence of mixed DNA inside the home adds further complexity. When genetic material from multiple individuals is found in the same location, separating and analyzing those profiles becomes more challenging. It requires advanced forensic work and time, but it remains a solvable problem. DNA evidence does not degrade in investigative value simply because time passes. As seen in past cases, material preserved for decades can still lead to identification once the right technology is applied. Brucato's behavioral analysis adds direction to this forensic process. If the offender's psychological profile suggests a history of antisocial or criminal behavior, then there is a meaningful chance that their DNA may already exist somewhere within law enforcement systems, from a prior arrest, conviction, or forensic encounter. In that sense, the genealogical method serves as a secondary path, while the possibility of a direct match remains open. From there, the analysis turns to what may have occurred inside the house during the 41-minute window when no cameras were recording. At this stage, Brucato outlines two primary scenarios. The first possibility is that the abduction itself was staged. In this scenario, the outward appearance, a kidnapping, ransom demands, communication with media, was constructed to mislead. The real intent from the beginning may not have been financial gain, but something else entirely, with the presentation of a ransom situation designed to redirect attention and delay accurate understanding of what actually happened. In the first scenario, the appearance of a kidnapping was intentional from the very beginning. It created the illusion of a financial motive, a living hostage, a ransom to be negotiated. That illusion shaped both public perception and investigative direction, focusing attention on the belief that Nancy Guthrie was alive somewhere, waiting to be recovered through a transaction. Within this framework, the planner, the chef, described by Dr. Gary Brucato, understood the value of that misdirection. It bought time. It diverted resources into a narrative that would take time to verify or disprove. If this interpretation is correct, the objective was never financial. The ransom elements were part of a constructed facade, masking a different underlying intent. The second scenario follows a different path. In this version, the kidnapping was real. The goal was financial gain: abduct Nancy, hold her, and use her family's resources, along with Savannah Guthrie's public profile, as leverage for payment. But something disrupted that plan. What disrupted it may have been the one factor no operation can fully control: the victim herself. Nancy was 84 years old, physically fragile, and dependent on medical support. But fragility does not equal compliance. Under extreme stress, removed from her home, her medication, and the monitoring of her pacemaker, her condition could have changed rapidly. These are variables that cannot be perfectly predicted. Acute stress, lack of medication, or a cardiac complication could have created a situation the perpetrators were not prepared to manage. In this scenario, the operation failed in real time. Not symbolically, but in a practical, operational sense. A medical emergency, unexpected resistance, or another complication made the original plan, detain, negotiate, release, no longer viable. At that point, the situation shifted. Detective Brian Martin, a cold case specialist, articulated this possibility directly. In his assessment, the individuals involved may have underestimated Nancy's health condition. When a crisis occurred, something physically overwhelming under already extreme stress. She ceased to be viable within a financial scheme. And once that happened, their calculation changed. In his words, the situation went sideways. The plan broke down. And when it did, the perpetrators made a different decision, one driven not by the original objective, but by the immediate reality that the objective could no longer be achieved. This interpretation is further reinforced by observations from Dr. Ann Burgess, whose work helped shape modern criminal profiling through her involvement with the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. Examining the physical evidence, she pointed to indications that something inside the house did not unfold as planned. Her focus centered on the blood evidence, its location, its pattern, and more importantly, what it fails to explain. The visible traces suggest movement, but not a complete story. The critical question she raised remains unresolved. Where does it lead? Her conclusion is stark. The blood does not account for a full sequence of events. It stops. And beyond that point, there is no clear public explanation. Nancy disappears from the known evidence trail. The physical signs suggest continuation, but the documented path ends without resolution. As of day 74, that gap remains. No official statement has clarified where the evidence leads next. No public update has closed that question. From this point, Brucato's analysis reaches its most difficult conclusion, one that follows directly from the behavioral patterns and statistical framework he has laid out, and one that requires careful consideration because of what it ultimately implies. The final stage of Dr. Gary Brucato's analysis brings together multiple elements: the indication of a psychopathic character structure, the likelihood of prior criminal behavior, the probability that more than one individual was involved, and the level of planning behind the operation. These factors converge into two possible scenarios. Either the abduction was staged from the outset, or it began as a genuine kidnapping that later shifted into something else. From that framework, Brucato introduces a difficult probability assessment. He states that if Nancy Guthrie is deceased, the likelihood of her remains being recovered intact is very low. This is not presented as a conclusion about her fate. Law enforcement has made no such determination, and the case remains open. Her family continues to hope for her safe return, as they should. What Brucato offers is narrower, a statistical inference based on offender type. Individuals who match the behavioral and psychological profile described in this case, calm under pressure, methodical, and capable of structured planning, tend, according to research, to handle evidence with the same level of precision they apply to the crime itself. That includes, in the most severe documented cases, the deliberate elimination of physical traces. This is not speculation detached from evidence. It is drawn from patterns observed across decades of academic study on violent offenders. A person who accounted for surveillance, entry points, and timing in advance is unlikely to neglect what comes afterward. The same operational logic typically extends to minimizing or removing evidence that could lead back to them. This conclusion is not where the analysis aims to go, it is where the data leads. It does not serve as a verdict, but as a probability grounded in established methodology. 74 days into the case, there is still no named suspect. A reward of approximately $1.2 million remains in place. The FBI has reviewed tens of thousands of tips, yet no definitive identification has been made. Brucato's work does not solve the case on its own, but it refines the investigative focus. That refinement matters. It suggests the person responsible is unlikely to be a random outsider. More likely, they exist within the broader environment connected to Nancy's life, someone with at least indirect familiarity, and someone whose past behavior may already be documented somewhere. In law enforcement records, institutional files, or personal recollections. It also reinforces the likelihood that the individual seen on the porch did not act alone. Behind that visible figure, there may be a second, more calculated presence. The planner, the one who understood the details of Nancy Guthrie's home, her routine, and her vulnerabilities well enough to make the operation possible. That person would not appear in obvious ways. They would exist in ordinary contexts, conversations, workplaces, routine interactions. Their knowledge might have surfaced subtly, questions about schedules, awareness of household details, familiarity that seemed unremarkable at the time. If Brucato's framework is accurate, then someone, somewhere, has already encountered this individual. Perhaps through prior criminal behavior, perhaps through a personal or professional interaction that did not initially seem important. But that connection exists. For that reason, even small pieces of information matter. A detail involving access to Nancy's home, a contractor or service provider, someone who showed unusual interest in her routine or family, any of these could be relevant. What may seem insignificant in isolation could align with the broader pattern described here. Nancy Guthrie has now been missing for 74 days. Her family, Cameron, Annie, and Savannah Guthrie, continue to search for answers. Investigators remain actively engaged. The analysis suggests that the person responsible is not unknowable. They have left traces. They are likely known, at least in some capacity, to others. The connection between that person and what happened on February 1st likely exists already, in records, in systems, or in memory, waiting to be recognized and reported. This assessment, originally presented by Dr. Gary Brucato, reflects a professional interpretation based on established research and behavioral science. It is not a determination by law enforcement, and no suspect has been officially identified. The investigation is ongoing, and anyone with information is encouraged to contact the appropriate authorities.